Geopolitical environment, the threat actors that are out there, the concerns with the Russian-Ukrainian war. We provide that deterrence role, but most importantly, provide safety and security to the countries that we are residing in right now as this multinational battle group here in Latvia. We have had a deep-seated history with the Latvians. We are on exercises with their Latvian armed forces very regularly as we enhance that overall NATO presence. It is such an honor to be here as part of this massive team, sharing those skills, reinforcing the strength of NATO, and reinforcing the overall presence that we have as part of NATO.
This will make new hair grow where you don't have hair. Don't use too much because it will grow too much. This shampoo.
NATO tanks have one common problem, which may have actually contributed to the failure of Ukraine's summer counter-offensive.
Just inside a tank our way into Gaza, there is rubble and destruction as far as you can see.
They're digging in their positions, they're practicing. Pinpoint accuracy over targets is what has transformed so much of this conflict.
This is World at War. I'm the Sun's defence editor, Jerome Starkey, and joining me today is Dr. Jack Watling, land warfare expert from the Royal United Services Institute here in London. Jack, you've written that tanks aren't dead, but they are too heavy.
Yes, certainly NATO tanks. So NATO tanks were developed in terms of the modern fielded fleets for defending West Germany in the 1980s. And therefore, they knew the terrain they were going to be fighting over, and they weren't expected to maneuver very much. They needed to survive for as long as possible in place to knock out as many Soviet tanks as possible. And what that led to was tanks which are fantastically accurate, very survivable, and extremely heavy. Now, to give you an example of the consequence of that, most bridges in Eastern Europe will not support vehicles that are over 60 tons within the weight distribution that a tank.
And let's be clear, the German Leopard 2, the American Abrams, the British Challenger 2 are all significantly over 60 tons.
Over that, yeah. So the Leopard is about 69, Challenger's 72, etc.
Compared to the Soviet tanks, which are
much lighter in the 40s and 50s. And so that's problem one. The second problem is that in order to keep a tank alive today, you need some additional things. You need electronic warfare protection, you need active protection that will intercept anti-tank guided weapons, and those things come at significant weight. An APS, an active protection system, needs radar, it needs cooling, it weighs about 3 tons. And so when you start not only adding that on the vehicle, but adding it on top of the vehicle, so it's becoming more top-heavy, you end up with a vehicle which will sink into the ground, quite literally, unless it is on the ideal type of terrain. And so in terms of the consequences of the counter-offensive last year, it meant that the Russians could look at a map, they could look at the weight of the vehicles, they could look at which routes would actually allow the passage of those vehicles, and then optimize their defense against those routes, because it was obvious that an attack with those vehicles would have to go down those routes.
So they knew where the Ukrainians were coming?
I mean, they knew where the Ukrainians were coming for other reasons too, right? So we shouldn't say this is monocausal. They understood the plans. But yes, this absolutely contributed, and it means that when US officers talk about maneuver and how you can achieve surprise by outflanking, and actually there's a lot less maneuver space in that environment than people often imagine, because their vehicles simply will not work on the ground that you might want to exploit.
So I spent time with the Challenger squadron in Ukraine, and they told me exactly this, that in fact the commander said he'd driven a T-72 and he'd driven a Challenger, and he said the Challenger kept on getting stuck.
Get stuck.
Good tank gets stuck, exactly. Accurate, well defended, but really couldn't move it around. And in fact, the day we were with them, we got stuck in the mud on a training range, so we saw it in real life.
And it's worth noting that that is what will get the Challenger destroyed, because as soon as it is in a known position and not moving from that position, that's when you'll get a whole series of drones coming over and knocking away at it, and they will destroy it.
We've seen that, indeed.
That's what happened, yeah.
Is there a sweet spot? Is there a correct weight that a tank should be?
So from the answer is as light as possible from a mobility point of view. Obviously, you also want the crew to be able to survive hits against most weapon systems. And what you tend to find is that something which will knock out a tank at 55 tons will still knock out the tank, even if it has enough armor at 80 tons.
Could NATO ever have to fight Russia in the way Ukraine is fighting Russia? Almost hand-to-hand, trench by trench, a brutal attritional contest dominated by drones and heavy artillery. They're certainly getting ready to. In the north of Estonia, where the Russians are barely an hour away by tank, French troops practice storming enemy trenches. Alongside them, providing heavy armoured support, Challenger tanks of the Royal Tank Regiment, part of the 1,000-strong British force permanently based in Estonia. There was catching up to do. If NATO was to successfully defend the Baltic states, they're confident they're now ready. If an invasion were to happen, God forbid, you could block it, stop it, defend against it?
Absolutely. We find ourselves in a position where we know the intimate details of where we would go and what we want to do, and simply it's a case of making sure we are ready all the time to go and react to that threat and do what we need to do.
No one thinks there's an imminent danger of Russian troops rolling across the border here, but for as long as the Russians prod and provoke with drones, with air incursions, with hybrid warfare, there's a danger of miscalculation. And from miscalculation can come escalation.
A month ago, Italian F-35s based here were scrambled to intercept a Russian fighter jet that flew for 12 minutes deep into Estonian airspace. Just a week ago, a menacing group of armed Russians forced Estonia to close a road that straddles the border. The Estonian view is that only visible strength will dissuade Russian provocations.
In order for the Russians not to miscalculate, every one of these provocative steps need to be answered with clarity so that they would not miscalculate regarding NATO security, territorial integrity, or our willingness to, if necessary, use force to defend ourselves.
And these NATO troops know the longer Ukraine stays in the fight against Russia, the more they are learning. The Ukrainians, by continuing to fight, are giving you time?
I should say that to that definitely yes. They providing us a time to be better prepared. They providing us as well a knowledge.
Knowledge of how drones now dominate a battlefield, of how to protect these armoured vehicles against drone warfare. NATO once taught the Ukrainians modern warfighting. The roles may slowly be reversing. James Mates, News at 10, Estonia.
So you're telling me I can straighten my teeth in as little as 4 to 6 months from just £38 a month?
Yep. The war drums are beating in Russia, with leaders from the Kremlin to London and Berlin saying we could be on the verge of a conflict.
Если Европа вдруг захочет с нами воевать и начнет, мы готовы прямо сейчас.
But given the heavy losses it's taken in Ukraine, is that really anything more than talk? Russia wants to maintain the image of itself as a great power ready for anything. And Western countries, with their squeezed public finances, need to make the case to boost their defence spending. But there's a reason for that. Things are changing, with big increases in Russian arms production and spending. So it's worth asking, what kind of threat does Russia pose to Europe? As always with estimates of this kind, that's a question of capability and intent. While the Russian military has taken a great deal of damage in Ukraine, much of its arsenal, including its strategic weapons, has not. They still maintain the world's biggest nuclear stockpile, around 5,000 warheads, mounted on 324 ballistic missiles, 71 bombers, and 12 missile-launching submarines. Those vessels are part of a force of more than 50 subs that are of particular concern to the UK. In recent months, there have been reports of Russian subs close to the Scottish coast and of their survey vessel Yantar mapping our undersea defences.
That Russian action is deeply dangerous, and this is the second time this year that this ship, the Yantar, has deployed to UK waters. So my message to Russia and to Putin is this: we see you, we know what you're doing, and if the Yantar travels south this week, we are ready.
Russia's Air Force has more or less managed to maintain its strength, having produced around 40 new fighter jets to replace the ones lost over Ukraine. And more importantly, they've also upped the production of missiles to mount on those aircraft. And new low-cost weapons, such as the Shahed attack drone, are being produced in huge numbers, more than 200 a day in fact. And they're using those liberally against Ukraine. If there was a ceasefire with that country and production of those drones continued at the same rate, they would soon have stockpiled thousands for possible use against NATO countries. And the same applies to many other types of munitions. Russia's arms industry is running hot, and they're making weapons at 4 times the rate of all NATO countries combined, including the US. So Russia does have considerable capabilities, but the Ukraine campaign has imposed enormous costs. Western countries tend to put very high estimates on the numbers of Russians killed, around 250,000 for example. Russian journalists tracking the actual names of the deceased reckon it's at least 150,000, maybe as much as 200,000. And critically among those are around 7,300 officers, the people actually commanding units at the front. That's a generation of future colonels and generals taken out.
Lieutenant General Fanil Savarov died when his vehicle exploded in the capital's Yasnaya district.
Russia's recent failure to exploit some limited advances in the Donbass is blamed by many analysts on the loss of that generation of skilled younger officers. And it will take a great deal of time for that know-how to be replaced. In addition to that human toll, some of the more sophisticated weapons, like tanks and fighter planes, are proving hard to replace also. That's in no small part due to Western sanctions. So the question is, how much time will it take Russia to restore its capabilities in those critical areas? The generals and spy masters want Europe to accelerate its rearmament. Furthermore, they warn that time is running out. An assessment carried out by NATO 2 years ago suggested that if the Ukraine war stopped, Russia would need until 2029 to rebuild its military. But the head of NATO has recently suggested that that timeline could be shortening.
We have a heavily reconstituting Russia at a pace which is really threatening. They cannot mount a successful attack against NATO territory now, but in 3 to 5 years they might be able.
And you can find shorter estimates, because the question of when will Russia be ready is a bit of an opinion sport. For example, the Norwegian defence chief has suggested that the Kremlin could rebuild its forces as soon as 2026 or 2027. Ultimately, it's a matter of educated guesswork. We don't know exactly how long it would take Russia to produce the munitions and reman their divisions to the point that they would feel confident that if they did get into a confrontation with a neighbouring NATO member, they would be able to overmatch the West. So,
what are this morning's Russian papers saying about Donald Trump's determination to take over Greenland? Well, the headline in Moskovsky Komsomolets refers to him as the mad chief doctor of the asylum. Last week brought a good joke. For decades, Denmark, as part of NATO, had been expecting Russia to attack it. But the attack has come from NATO. You get the feeling that in the asylum, the head doctor too has gone mad, and everything has gone to pieces. But what can you do? He's in charge. Europe is at a total loss, and to be honest, it's a pleasure to watch this. What, should NATO countries start fighting with one of the founders of NATO? I'd watch that. This is